I just gave a walkthrough of the application Supabase and how we use that to create a database that we can connect to. The important things there to remember are we had a URL to connect to the database and an API key. Okay, and then the other thing was that we used the table editor feature of Supabase to actually create a table of data. So then the question is, how do we connect to that database from our code base? First of all, remember we talked about package JSON, which is in Node, or NPM, which is the package manager of Node. This is the file that you use to declare the dependencies of your application. And obviously, you know until now our dependencies are Next, React. React has a separate library called React DOM, and SWR. So now we're adding a new dependency called Supabase. This is the name of Supabase. So for yourselves to add it to your code base, you're going to need to run npm install and then Supabase. And mine's already installed, so that was very quick, but that will install Supabase into your project for you. And it will modify your package JSON and your package lock files to reflect the fact that those are now registered as dependencies of your project. So when you do your next git commit, you will commit those changes to your repository so that there is dependencies with your code base. Okay, so the first step to using Supabase is to make sure you've got the client installed. Then, as we said, we have a way we need to connect to Supabase, and there's two values, the URL and an API key. Now, the API key is secret, so you don't want to keep it in your code base in some type of location that you would commit to your repository. You want to keep it, but not have it committed with your code so that someone else could maybe accidentally find, or you could accidentally publish your secret key to the public or something like that. So there's a convention in most programming languages and sort of web server deployment to use env files, .env. Env files are basically plain text of keys and values. There's an uppercase name, an equal sign, and then a value. Okay? Now, what you can do, you can read up about environment variables and env files. I added some links in the lessons. But what we need to do now is create a .env.local file. That's a file that when Next.js loads, it looks for it to load environment variables from. And also because of the pattern of the name, it ensures that you don't commit that file into your Git repository. Okay, so what I've done is pasted the URL of my Supabase database into here, Supabase _URL equals, and then Supabase _service key equals. Okay, so the first step is that I set them there in the environment file, and when Next.js runs, it will read from this file to get variables as part of its runtime configuration. It will just read them into something called the environment, which is part of the operating system. It's not actually part of JavaScript or anything. It will ensure that these are accessible on the environment. Okay? And then you will have seen that we've got a file called config.js, which we've used already. Now, config is just a convention, but a very, very, very common convention to set the constants of your application. So we've already seen it with API base or maybe image base. Now we're going to get those environment variables that we put on the environment and read them in as constants within our code base. So Supabase URL will be set to the value of process env Supabase URL. So process env in Node is the way you access the environment of the operating system that Node is running in. And as I said, using this convention, Next.js makes sure that these values are available on the operating system environment. Okay, so so 2 steps. One is you set the actual secrets in this env local file, which never gets checked into your code base. And then in the con file, you set a reference to those variables, and this is in your code base, but obviously the secret is not available. So you see it's of a different name. In fact, the Supabase URL is not actually a secret. It's the service key that is, but here I'm treating them both the same. Okay? There's reasons why you could do that, because you might use different URLs for different environments. You might have a different database locally, a different one on production, so it's not necessarily truly like a constant value. So you would set it in this way. Okay. So then from there, we know that we've installed the Supabase client. We've set up the environment to read the values that we need. We're reading those values from the environment into variables within our JavaScript application. And then we create a new module. Here I called it data store. I've created it as a separate module, mostly for reasons of code abstraction and sort of good separation of concerns. I might send a quick video about that a bit later, because that's a question that's come up a bit. But I've created a separate module called data store that reads from Supabase.js, exposes a function called create client. So I import its create client function. I import the variables that I've just set, which at runtime will be those secret values from the environment. And then I'm initializing a client. This is the Supabase convention for how to initialize a client, by passing a URL and a service key. And then that return value is an actual client that's been initialized and is able to communicate with the database. And then I'm exporting that here as client. Okay? So they're the steps to install Supabase, configure Supabase, and ultimately get reference to an object that we call client, in this case, that can communicate with Supabase. The next step is hooking that up with the rest of our application. So let's just move from Supabase for a minute and talk about APIs. So as we explained in class, because our connection to our database is secret, we're actually running the connection on our server and not on the client code. We're not directly communicating with Supabase from our browser. Our application running in the browser is going to post data to an API endpoint of ours on our application. And then there on the application server, we're going to connect to the database using the secret connection key that we have. Okay, so that way our secret connection key is never exposed publicly, not in a browser, but also, not by committing the code somewhere. And the client code running in the browser doesn't need to know anything about how it connects. It just gives data and expects a response back. Okay, so as we already saw with Next, anything you put under the pages directory, apart from the ones that start with an underscore, which are part of Next's own conventions, everything you put here creates a page. So we've already got an about page and we've already got a contact page. By creating a file called about.js, we get a URL, which is about. By creating a file called contact.js, we got a URL called contact. Now, they do the same thing. If you create a folder called API, this will expose API endpoints. And again, by convention, any name that you put in here, any named module that you put in here will be exposed as an API endpoint. So let's say that we created a file called test. Okay, now an API endpoint for next has a particular signature. Export default function, handler, response, request are the two parameters it's passed. Let me check if that's 100% right. Exactly, it's right. Now we can call it async, although it's not necessary. Okay, so when you create an API endpoint in Next, you create a module underneath the Tikia API, and then you put a handler. This is the signature of the handler. The first argument is the response. Is there a response? No, other way around, right? Yes. First argument is the request, and the second argument is the response. Okay. Okay, so this has already exposed something. Now, to return a value, we do response, send, hi, this works. Okay, let's see. So now, pay attention. We've got a page called test under API. We've written a handler, and we respond with a response. Okay, that's how you do a response. Okay, so run dev. The response is supposed to be hi, this works. So let's check that that actually works as I expect. Too many things open. Here it is. Okay. Was that port 3000? Yes. Okay. So then we should have API test. Hi, this works. Okay. So that's the most basic API response that we've been able to do. Okay. Now, obviously, you could send back some JSON. So we could do message. Hi, this works. Whatever status 200. Okay. And that's turned into a JSON response. Next takes care of the JSON stuff automatically for us. Whatever you put in there, it will turn into a JSON object. Okay, so that's the basics of how the API works. Now, back to Supabase. We create a handler. Okay, let's try and minimize all of this. Forget about all of that for the moment. We import our client from the data store module that we created. So this is our Supabase client. I've also got another variable that I set up called contact form table name, which is just the table name AFL contact submissions, which if you remember from the video on the Supabase UI, that's the table that I created for my contact form submissions. Okay, so Next has a syntax for connecting to a table from this contact, and then you perform an action. So in this case, insert. Okay, so that's the syntax, and these are the methods, some of the methods that the client exposes. So we're saying, get me this table with this name, and then insert this data into it. So if you remember, this is the actual data that I have. So we got a request. We looked at we pulled the data out of the request, and then we sent it to our database. And that's, if you remember, we have a column called name, a column called email, and a column called comment, and that writes that data into that database. Okay. Now, I know that glosses over a few different things. What I would recommend you do is two things. One, have a look at my code for this. Do things like try and understand what's going on there. Why did I do that? Okay, for example. Do things like send requests, like go back to the test example that I've got, and do something like console log request. Have a look at the object of the request. What is it? What does it have on it? What are the properties that it has? Same with here. We know here that there's a property called request body. There's other properties as well. And likewise with the response. Next gives us a response object to use, which has certain properties on it. And you could look at what those are just to learn about them. Okay, by logging it as you send requests to the endpoint. Then you see that there's a way to return responses in next. In next. Okay. Now, Supabase. Too many details. Let's see. Okay. For further reading, you can go to the guide section of Supabase and have a look here at the database section, which goes through various aspects of using and gives some more information on how to use it. You can also go to, let's see, Supabase. Let's have a look where it is. Supabase. Here let's see if that gives us what we want. No, okay. Pretty sure I put it here. Supabase client API documentation. You should also go here to read more about that, what I was doing in here. What is this? From table name, insert, okay? So all of that information is available here in the JavaScript library reference. Okay, and particularly go here to the database section and you can find information, examples of how to fetch data, what the methods are, how to insert data, what the methods are, how to modify data, what the methods are, how to delete data, etc., etc. Okay, so you've got the references in my code, which is very simple, and you've got further reading, further methods that you can read about here.